was just a fraud made up. You called, I mean, from A to Z, exactly what their fraud was. And now in the last year, we had the one-year anniversary of the kickoff of ClimateGate just last week. It has all come out, but they've spun it with Pachauri in the New York Times saying, we're sorry, we got it wrong, it was a mistake. But we know it wasn't a mistake. It is a hoax of hoaxes for them to beat this drum that no scientist disagrees. There is a total consensus when we know the consensus is on the other side saying it's a fraud. So it would seem that they would have to be dead in the water, but they're not. California has passed the carbon tax. The city of Austin has passed it. Areas of Europe are engaging in it. Can you go over some of the frauds that have taken place and where you see this group of tyrants in their attempt to seize the global economy and set up their world government? I mean, who's winning the ball game?
There's no doubt on the science, the tyrants have lost. That's why I say this key central point, which I will just finish because it's a very important one, is that of those who, this tiny few dozen who have worked on the question how much warming we get, the ones that do it by playing with Xbox 360s and PlayStations, and they do it on the, on sort of computer games, computer models, they are the ones that say we've got a problem, but they're not dealing with the real world. All the ones who do it as I do, by measurement and observation, and then thinking about what we've measured and observed, we are saying, no, there isn't a problem. Yes, you'll get some warming, but it simply won't be enough to worry about. And so far, it is we who are being proved right. The main fraud, which they still try to get away with, is that temperatures are rising at a terrible rate. And just earlier this year, I had a guy from the BBC on to me. He said, what questions would you put to Professor Jones at the University of East Anglia, right at the heart of this ClimateGate thing? He's the guy that was producing the sort of trumped-up temperature records for the world. And he was right at the heart of this conspiracy, and he was then saying, let's all destroy our data so nobody can check it. He was saying this in emails to some of his scientific colleagues, this extraordinary man. But he was then interviewed, because it all came out in public as a result of ClimateGate. And so the BBC put to him a question that I had given to him. I simply said, has there been any statistically significant warming since 1995? And his answer was, no, not really. He said there has been just a little, but it's barely significant at best. And so here we are, now getting the truth, because I told the BBC what the right question was to ask. So all this stuff about how the world is heating up at an unprecedented rate, all of that we now know not to be true. And in fact, at each stage, the climate left, the climate Marxist, the climate extremists, call them what you will, are being forced back and forced back from their original positions. First of all, they were saying we could measure the increase of temperature at the surface, then that didn't happen. Then they said, well, but it'll all be happening in the upper air, about 6 miles up above the tropics. It should warm 3 times as fast up there as it does down here. Then we checked 50 years of temperature records for the upper troposphere and the tropics and found there had been no such tripling of the surface warming rate. That meant it wasn't man-made warming that was happening. Then they said, well, the warming must be going somewhere, because actually, they had to admit that there hasn't really been much in the way of warming over the last 15 years since this topic became exciting in the public print. And so now they're saying, well, the warming must be hiding in the deep oceans, waiting to come out and catch us all by surprise. The fact is, the arguments they're now trying to produce to make it look as though we still have a problem are wearing very thin, even on their own ears. Now, you mentioned the Himalayas recently. It's now been admitted that they lifted the story about all the Himalayan ice disappearing in the next 25 years from a report by a Marxist journalist quoting an environmental activist friend of his. It wasn't a scientific report, it wasn't peer-reviewed, it wasn't published in any journal. That is the kind of material which the IPCC, the UN's climate panel, that we entrust with getting this stuff right, is using and then saying that this is the sort of material we have to pay attention to.
Yes, Lord Monckton.
And for months, just to finish this, for months, Pachauri was saying there's nothing wrong with this. Indeed, the Himalayan ice really will be gone. Anybody who said it isn't, he said, is a climate denier and is putting the planet at risk. And now he's had to eat crow and admit that he got it wrong. Why didn't he do that a whole lot sooner?
And there's been dozens of these, but I mean, specifically, I get these emails. I watch television. I see the globalist relishing when they talk about we have peer-reviewed journals, you don't, when it's a lie. We have almost all the real peer-reviewed journals. They just make up fantastical frauds, and they relish going over these. But in the time we have left, I specifically want to get into what's coming up at this conference that you're going to be reporting for us on graciously from Cancun, Mexico, and how we, the American people and others listening all over the world, how we ensure that this scheming group of people seeking to seize control of the global economy, how do we ensure that they are defeated?
Right. The first thing that your listeners should do, and you should do it immediately, I mean in the next 24 hours, is to get in touch with your congressmen and your senators and say to them that Fred Upton, who is a rhino, a Republican in name only, should not be appointed the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee now the Republicans have taken control of it, because Fred Upton is a true believer in the whole global warming rubbish. He votes with the Democrats on this as on practically everything else. If he takes control of that committee, vast amounts of damage can be done, and indeed the world might yet find itself going under a climate tyranny, a world government. And that one appointment is, in my view, what could make the difference between keeping the freedom, prosperity and democracy of the West and losing it. The candidates against Fred Upton are Joe Barton, the current ranking member of the committee on the Republican side. He's a very wonderful man from Texas. I know him well, love him dearly. He's a terrific piece of work, really magical man. And he, by rights, should get this. There's another one called Representative Shimkus, who's also a candidate. He would be very good. I think Joe Barton would probably be better, but Shimkus would be very nearly as good. Either of those would be perfectly acceptable as chairman of that committee. But Fred Upton, who is not reflecting the opinion of the Republican Party on this or many other issues, he would be a disaster, and he might work with the Democrats to see to it that somehow we got Congress to start legislating in this area where at the moment it has failed to do so. So get on to your senators and your congressmen and tell them it mustn't be upped. It mustn't be upped.
Also, the alternative media that's now beginning to displace the corporate prostitute media, we need to really report on what's coming up in the next 2 weeks.
That's absolutely right, because the next thing is there is already a treaty in draft. It no longer contains quite such explicit and open admissions that they're trying to set up a world government as previous treaty drafts did. Nevertheless, it's now going to follow the approach that the EU took, the European Union. They did a little treaty here, a little treaty there, each one not adding too much to the one that previously happened. But by the time you've done 40 years of this, all our freedoms in Britain have gone. 5/6 of our laws are now made in Europe by people we don't elect, and only 1/6 made in Britain by people we do. That's how fast you can lose your freedoms if you have this kind of salami-slicing approach to setting up treaties. So very important, therefore, that you keep an eye on this process, because what Obama is going to try to do, he knows he can't get any treaty coming out of Cancun ratified in the Senate, not after the Republican landslide. There's no way he can get it ratified by a three-quarters majority of the Senate. What they will therefore try to do is to enact the Cancun agreement, not as a treaty, but either as U.S. legislation, if they think they can get it through both houses. That would be difficult by a much smaller majority than the treaty would require, of course. Or he will use the EPA and the Democrat states like California to enact the legislation round the back. And that is what his plan is. And the people at Cancun know perfectly well that they can't therefore call the Cancun Accord anything like a treaty. If they call it a treaty, it has to go in front of the Senate where it will be defeated. So it won't be called a treaty.
Lord Monckton, we're almost out of time. I want to cover several other subjects. We know this move towards world government is not just coming out of the UN and the Club of Rome and these people that want to seize control of all energy production. We also know that the big central mega banks are involved in financing this, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan. And a few weeks ago, in a debate in the UK House of Lords, Tory life peer Lord James Blackheath and when we played the video here, said that a Foundation X apparently has offered to give the UK